Hi, this is Santi Gold, and you're listening to my podcast, Noble Champions, conversations to expand your mind, feed your soul, and push culture forward. On the first season of Noble Champions, I used themes from my 2022 album, Spirituals, as a jumping-off point for in-depth conversations on topics like motherhood, climate change, spirituality, and intergenerational trauma. This second season, we're continuing to explore pressing issues or big questions that I find myself thinking or talking about all the time, topics that I'm excited to explore. I've been thinking a lot recently about creativity and imagination, and how important human imagination is in shaping our future. The world is obviously in a very precarious place at the moment, so it's a crucial time for art that envisions what a better future might look like. The topic of today's episode is Afrofuturism, which I think is a perfect framework for this conversation. I've been talking about this idea a lot recently with my friend John Jennings, who's a New York Times bestselling author of graphic novels, comics, and anthologies, who co-authored and illustrated the graphic novel adaptations of Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and Kindred. He's also a professor and scholar, as well as the director of Megascope, an Abrams Comic Arts imprint which publishes graphic novels focused on the experiences of people of color. But to me, John is a brilliant thinker who laughs at me all the time for how little I know about a lot of things. My second guest is Terence Nance, an artist, musician, and filmmaker who created the surreal HBO series Random Acts of Flyness. His album Vortex was released in 2022. Terence is also an all-around innovative thinker whose work is deeply personal, often poetic, but always idiosyncratic. So let's get this going. Who am I talking to?
Yeah, my name is John Jennings, and I am a professor of media and cultural studies at the University of California at Riverside. That's my day job. I'm also a graphic novelist, visual artist, theorist, design thinker, publisher, curator, and a bunch of other stuff. But essentially, I'm a cartoonist with a terminal degree. So that's about it. And I teach classes on Black speculation and Afrofuturism here at the university, particularly one right now.
And horror.
And horror, yeah. Right now I'm doing one on race and horror, which is one of my favorite things. So, yep.
Cool.
Amazing.
Terence?
I'm an artist. I make films, I make music and rituals. And yeah, in general, that's what I'm up to.
Sounds like a Santi introduction. That's very good. What kind of ritual?
I think that most of my most recent ritual practice is trying to craft rituals that shift my consciousness towards deindustrializing myself, my body, my spirit, and offering a mythology or a narrative through which that can sustain, that practice of deindustrializing.
That is a very good answer.
And with that,
I know why we're having a conversation today, because that's exactly where I'm at, seriously, like personally. And it's interesting because this episode isn't really going to be about Afrofuturism. I tricked you guys. I really want to talk about some of the tools of imagining and how important it is to creating a future. And I think Afrofuturism is a really interesting framework to have that conversation in and around. So I just wanted to know if you could both explain a little bit about what Afrofuturism is to you and why and how is it important to your worldview.
The original term, even though I think what we've been doing as a people of the African diaspora, we've always been using like a Black radical imagination since the beginning. But Mark Derry came up with this term, Afrofuturism, in like the 90s. And I think he was trying to codify things that were happening around cyberculture, because this is when the web was being born and stuff like that. A lot of the work that I'm thinking about is recentering Blackness or recentering like Afrocentricity and the Black radical imagination through like what I call liberation technologies, rethinking how ancestral technologies are on the same level as what we think of as modern technologies, and also trying to create a future or think about a future space where Black folk are free and have like a particular level of agency. I think so for me, it's like thinking about ancestral technologies, managing the past and the future, but also thinking about like these liberation technologies like songs and music and comics and all these other things that actually kind of resituate where we are as artists and storytellers, so that's like really general, but that's not the definition that I wrote, but that's how I think about it. So I'm always trying to, in my classes, create students who are like citizen designers who are trying to muck up the system. Very similar to what you said, Terence, and what you're thinking about, Santi, is how do we actually like create or infect students to a certain degree with this kind of insatiable curiosity about the world. So that's kind of like where my head is with all the work that I'm doing. But mostly I do comics and, try to disturb people with comics.
I resonate with that term, ancestral technology specifically. I had never heard it connected to the term Afrofuturism until you just did so. So I appreciate that invitation to connect those things. And for me, the first time I remember hearing the term was, I believe, in 2013. And it was Martine Sims' Mundane Afrofuturist Manifesto. And I remember I was in Chicago. I think she was living there at the time, and she presented it at the Black Radical Imagination film screen series that Aaron Cristobal and Amir George did for many years.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that's what it was. Or maybe just aired it. Maybe they were in the room. But I just remember how beautiful that piece of writing was. She's an amazing artist and writer,
Yes.
Martine. And if I remember correctly, I haven't read it in a long time, but I was really struck by just how I kind of took the piss out on this idea of like techno futurist aesthetic framework for the term Afrofuturism, and like using the mundane as a space to express a more like lived in kind of maybe normcore vibe, like what Blackness is and could be. And obviously at that time I had just finished Oversimplification. I think that was very much like what I was looking at. I was trying to figure out kind of poetic dimension to banality in a way. So I was like on that, and I thought she was doing a really cool thing poetically with really a poetic text to just sort of make fun of the sort of constant, like, we spacesuits, black people, that kind of thing, So I resonate with that. She just mastered that kind of that tongue in cheek that goes way deeper than the tongue in cheek thing, So that was my connection to it, and I still connect. I still think that's operative for me in a way.
I was thinking about when you said when you first came to Afrofuturism, and I remember coming to Afrofuturism as a term like 2008 or so. And I'm a big fan of Martine Sims' work as well because she's trained as a designer. And so when I read it, I was like, someone is doing like some design thinking here. And I was like, yeah, this is really cool. And also she remixed it from like I think it was a manifesto about science fiction too, the mundane science fiction manifesto. And that idea of the elevation of the mundane is something that has become part of my work as well, as far as like thinking about not necessarily just survival, but also just thinking about the ideas around futurism and child rearing and making art and things of that nature. So that's really cool. And I'm a big fan of that film series as well.
There's so many things that you guys said. I wanted to just paint this picture a little bit more for people that don't really know necessarily as much as you guys like me about this. But I tend to shy away from labels and names, particularly when you put Black on something and didn't put it in a little box, you know what I mean? Where it's like,
right.
So when I first heard Afrofuturism, I was like, what is this one now? You know what I mean?
Right.
Because Afrofuturism, the term, came about in the 90s, but people have been doing this since, as you pointed out, 1909. People have been writing these type of what you called speculative fiction stories and imagining what I mean, sci-fi is a very specific thing, but like surrealist is, I think, how you categorize a lot of the things that are just sort of out of this world or otherworldly or other dimensional or just imagining coming up alternative realities, basically, and to serve as ways of making sense of the past and the future, which is what Afrofuturism proposes to be. But when we were talking about it, I was like, well, is this Afrofuturism? You're like, well, no. Is this? No. And it's because it has to be sci-fi. It has to be this. It has to be this. And it's like, well, if Black people have been doing this forever, and if all these things that are actually doing the same thing are outside of the box, what is expansive about the idea of Afrofuturism and what is restrictive?
Well, so to your point, I had never heard of the term until like the early 2000s. I was actually making artwork about stereotypes, because stereotypes are mostly about fixity. In fact, the word stereos means hard or fixed, right? It's a printing term. And so I was doing some work in Japan and I came across what they call techno-orientalism, like the Black techno stuff, the giant robots and stuff like that. And I started thinking about cyborgs again, right? And so I made these Black cybernetic entities. And a friend of mine who is an Africanist, studies like African art, said, oh, these look really Afrofuturist. And I was like, that's not a real thing. And then when I started doing a little digging, I realized this was a term. And then I looked at Derry's definition, which actually is really interesting because he talks about African-American themes, you know what I'm saying? And that's one thing that's really interesting about the work. he doesn't really look at the diaspora at first. He's just talking about African American concerns. He's also talking about more formal aspects too, like you're saying, limitations, right? Black cyborgs and stuff like that.
Mm.
But then he also uses the term technoculture or technology. And so I'm really interested in what kinds of technologies. And then, of course, I came across The Last Angel of History by John Jennings, right? 1997 or so. And he references music, and particularly the blues, as a Black secret technology. And I'm from Mississippi, so I've heard this story, the crossroads and stuff like that, but I'd never heard of music as a technology. But essentially, it is an extension of ourselves. And it just blew my mind. And then, of course, when I started digging around, I come across stuff like Amiri Baraka's Rhythm Travel, which is a time travel narrative where you actually become music and travel to wherever that song has been played or will be played. That's wild to me.
Mm.
So that's when I start thinking about other types of alternative technologies that push back against the limitations of not only Western cyberculture and technoculture, but also limitations of ourselves. And then, of course, one particular technology that we're always trying to unearth is race itself, race as a technology, which I became really interested in. And so Beth Coleman wrote this piece called Race as Technology, which kind of decenters identity being racialized. It actually functions more like a box or a technology. So I actually taught a design class called Race as Technology, where I used your image, Santi, the one that you did with Wangechi Mutu.
And that's officially Afrofuturist, correct?
Just because of some of the trappings of, like, what is a speculative thing? Like, is it magical or is it technological? And this is something that Nnedi Okorafor talks about. Like, is it fantasy or is it sci-fi? And that's the only thing. But as a writer, you think about genre a lot. And like you're saying, like Terence has kind of mentioned this too, to a certain degree, it's like they try to box you up and put you in these spaces. So I think Afrofuturism just rolls off the tongue nicely. It's, it's like Afrofuturism trademark at the end of it, But really, Afrofuture is a space to me. It's a place I want to try to get to. And so the last thing I'm going to say is about the definition thing. It's like, because it was created, Mark Derry is a white scholar, right? And so a lot of Black scholars didn't dig that. So we actually started coming up with multiple terms. And so by coming up with multiple terms, you also disrupt the original term too.
Why was it so important to have this term in the first place? I know with the success of things like Black Panther or Get Out and the exhibits that they're having at the museum, Carnegie Hall, like, do you think having this term helped open doors to this type of creativity or the genre?
I mean, I think to a certain degree. What's interesting is, for this podcast, I was thinking about the progression of the term and this kind of reintroduction of it to a certain degree to popular culture. And I want to say, to me, and we talked about this before too, this new iteration of Afrofuturism kind of pops into view because of the election of Barack Obama as a president. I feel that's a very sci-fi surreal moment, And then I don't think like Ryan Coogler's film doesn't come out till like 2018 when it really breaks wide as a term, But between then, you have all these different things that are happening that I found really interesting. These different shows, which I think actually, Terence, I think you had a piece in there, right? There was a film, right, that was connected to it, as I recall. Or am I making that up? It was Sanford Bigger's piece. It was at the Studio Museum, but it was like Sanford Bigger's piece. It was a quilt.
Oh yeah. We did something together.
Yeah, film. Yeah, and so so I'm friends with Sanford. Also friends with I want to say Fenonche Wilkins was in that as well as an actor.
He is, yeah.
And so, but that was in a show at the Studio Museum that was a pretty pivotal show. But it was also more about speculation. People call it the Afrofuturism show, but it wasn't necessarily that.
So you think that commercialism of being able to show that this thing could make money has opened some doors, basically?
I'm nodding on a podcast.
I don't think it has. I think no, but I'm traumatized, so I don't know.
I'm sorry.
I don't have a truth. I just have an experience, But I do think that
why are you traumatized?
I think, how do I get to that? Something you said about resisting genre, just as an artist, as a musician, like I was just not wanting to be named. I think I have, and I think a lot of us, as Black artists and just Black people is interested in liberation for ourselves. We have a real like spidey sense for when white people like something too much. You know what I'm saying? And like you kind of getting off on that. Like, I don't know. I don't trust it. And obviously, as you said, I didn't really know that, John, that Mark Derry's white. So it's like a white man created it and then they just like it a lot. They just say it a lot. They program a lot of shit. It gets the side eye as a phonetic experiment, even without, trying to parse out its meaning. It's just like, that's their thing. You know what I mean? And I think to the point of why ancestral technology resonated with me, and maybe it's the term that maybe should be at the center of all of these conversations, is because
I have a whole for that term coming up because I'm so into it.
Yeah.
I kind of want the conversation going there, but you can go for it.
Yeah, please do.
Because it replaces like the inherent linear time construct that's in the term Afrofuturism.
Mhm.
It replaces it with just how we understand time, as Black people, which is it's everything's always happening all at once,
Wait, so you're saying we don't understand time in a way, or you're saying as Black people, we do understand that everything's happening at once, or that we're more of the linear time mindset currently?
The former, that the term Afrofuturism, just by the nature of what it is entirely invested in a linear time construct. That there is a future and it is not now.
Okay.
And we're being, barreling towards it.
But who understands that that's not how time actually works?
Well, the Dagara, for instance, right? The Dagara are a tribe in kind of northern Ghana and Togo. They understand that they call young people in the Middle Ages. So the youngest is somebody who's, let's say, 50. And the oldest are the babies and the elders because they're closest to the transition moment.
Interesting.
So that's just one. I mean, there's, but I think that, the ancestor who I'm tapped into from that culture, Malcolm Musome and Sabofu Some, Malcolm has a chapter in one of his books about ancestral technology. And he tells this fable about some, colonizer giving a chief in the village a motorbike. And he almost crashes the motorbike. He almost kills himself on the motorbike because he doesn't know how to drive it. And also, like, he drives it for a long time and it stops working. And he's like, the white man fooled me. This thing don't work. And it's just because it's out of gas because nobody told him it's gas, right? And he just uses that to say, like, ritual is like that too. If you don't nobody tell you how to use it, you will run out of gas in the middle of nowhere and be stranded and might die. You know what I mean? Like, it's a technology. It's a tool that, extends us, helps us pass through the limitations of our body or our spirit. And we have to understand our spiritual practices, our cosmologies, our stories as having that utility, And I think maybe a greatest hit of the fables or the ritual technology is to break down time in that way and to understand, Sankofa basic, to know what you're doing right now, you got to be able to look back, like basic West African fable concept, So I think it's like...
It's like in line with quantum physics and understanding of time, right? Not that I understand.
Exactly. They just get into that.
Yeah. I mean, just the idea that everything is happening simultaneously, like basically through veils, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm. I'm so excited right now. I'm sorry. All the stuff you just said, I'm like, yes.
I mean, well, also the idea, because I'm writing a memoir. I've been so much invested in like the telling of the stories, and because I've been speaking to a lot of my cousins and aunts who are in their late 70s and 80s and getting these stories and learning all this stuff about basically how, people didn't talk and people didn't feel. It was like all secrets. And so there's all this, bound up, like nobody was free in any way. Do you know what I mean? Well, they might have been free from many of the things that we're not free from, but just in terms of like their personal freedom and in listening to their stories and telling their stories. If you think about the fact that if everything is really happening all at the same time, it's actually freeing up everyone. It's actually lifting this weight off of everyone to be able to get this out and to share this. And I feel like everyone's invested in it, like ancestrally. My aunts, I've never talked to any of them so much, and they're so eager to tell the stories. And it's just so interesting, the idea that by doing something in the present, you can actually change something in the past and not in the Back to the Future way. Do you know?
Oh, I do. Yeah. Very much so.
Since we've jumped into technology, and I really want to come back to your idea of race as a construct and as sci-fi. I'm just putting that out there that I want to come back to that.
Oh.
But like, what is ancestral technology?
Well, the way I think about it, it's so much stuff in my head. Well, Terence actually mentioned some of it. As far as like storytelling, oral cultures and things of that nature, when I think about how technology is used and the fact that they create nomenclature to create labels is a type of colonization as well, and that's something I'm very...
It is. That's why I have such and I hate when everything's like black this and black that, where white just gets to be the regular and then we have to put black in front of everything. I feel like it's really limiting. And I mean, I'm traumatized because that's me coming out of the Black music department, when I first started, or,
I understand.
and
Yeah.
it's very limiting.
So yeah, that's changed a lot. I mean, there is such a thing now as whiteness studies, because now white is now become a race thing, and white people are losing their minds about it sometimes. But anyway, so I came into it because I was thinking about like just my upbringing in Mississippi with my grandmother, who's probably like a conjure woman. Just looking at my research. I've been looking at like hoodoo culture, root work, things of that nature, and other African connected practices, particularly in my research. And so I started thinking about like just the idea of what that means, like writing as technology, music, song, dance, all these different things, and relating that back to the fact that in our country, or just in the diaspora, we've always used our art making and our voices as resistance strategies, right? It's something that we've always done in the music, the culture, that kind of thing. And I was also thinking about, there's this scholar named Kadwo Eshun, and he wrote this book called More Brilliant Than the Sun, Adventures in Sonic Fiction, where he was talking about like music was our science fiction, right? It is our science fiction. And then he was talking about, in a further essay, about colonizers always try to leave us in the past, right? So like, for instance, we're always primitive. Our music is always like not as good or something like that. That's why you don't, in the 1950s, up until the 1950s, 60s, you don't see people of color in the future, right? Right.
Or even in the Jetsons. When was that made?
Exactly. The Jetsons, that's like 1960s, I believe. Yeah, I think who's it talks about that. N.K. Jemisin talks about that. Like the Jetsons freaks her out. Up until like the Outer Limits, you don't really see like Black folk in the future, right?
Yeah, what's fucked up is I didn't even notice that there was no Black people in the Jetsons. So it's like, this is awesome.
Yeah, because you're not thinking about the politics of it.
Because I was already colonized in the mind.
Right, I'm colonizing the mind. So there's these sisters out of Philly, Rashida Phillips, More Mother. They have this term called Black quantum futurism, and so they've actually created an entire
There's
idea.
so many terms.
Well, here's the thing, because first of all, we're in the academy. You got to name stuff so you can write about it. It's just the system that we're in, but you find ways to work through. It's just, it's a hustle. I'm sorry. Well, it's strategery. You have to actually have like a space, because these are where our ideas are made, or in this space. And we're just fighting on all fronts.
Like laying claim to an idea, basically.
Right. And then you back it up with facts, because we now know.
And then you market it. And then you market it. And then you get museum
and then
exhibits.
You get tenure. So you mentioned the idea like science fiction, for instance. It was coined in like 1929 by Hugo Gernsback, right? But we were creating sci-fi or creating things that could be considered science fiction in the early 1900s. I mean, Du Bois wrote The Princess Steel in like 1909. Like you said, you had Pauline Hopkins was writing stuff. We were already thinking ahead and thinking about the causality.
And like Ralph Ellis.
Of what it means, yeah. And so a classic example, like what Terence gave, was the idea of simultaneity, or the breaking down of time. You ever seen Daughters of the Dust by Julie Dash?
Yes.
So Julie Dash, she creates this film about the Gullah people moving in from the Sea Islands. And so the narrator is a little girl who has not been born yet. She's not even born yet. And so you can see her through the technology of the camera, but she's a spirit that's actually haunting the present. And she's actually there to teach her father that she is his daughter. I'm like, whoa, that's just mind blowing to me. And so there's a simultaneity of these generational shifts, that your progeny and your ancestors are there at the same time. It's something that is very much part of our culture. And so I started thinking about what I call liberation technologies. I started seeing white sci-fi writers using metaphors that are in like objects they were creating inside of stories, what they call diegetic prototypes is what they call them. But then I realized that we had them as well. For instance, Black No More, there's this chair that turns Black people into white people, but not phenotypically. But even in Terence's work, for instance, you have the Bitch Better Have My Money app, right? Which is awesome, by the way. Just a technology that's actually there to have a discussion about something. So it's diegetic in nature. Or even like the cream that we're using for, what was it, albinitis? I forgot what the disease was.
White be gone.
White be gone. Yeah, exactly. So these like products are not being mass produced. They're there to have a discussion. So I became obsessed with finding them in everybody's work. But you also have ancestral technologies like root work and things of that nature, singing, oral culture, all these different things that I think are equivalent to what is being called culture and marketed as technology.
Well, I actually want to tie in the race thing that you said earlier, because Terence, I read a quote, and I'm going to read this quote, and it's a long quote, but basically, you said, "I think our ancestors did imagine us surviving and had to in order to survive themselves. I think that there's a matter of factness to Africanness persisting forever that's related to this kind of foundational confidence we have that everyone came from the same place, even non-Black people, and that there's a foundational Africanness to all things." And I think that's interesting, especially as, John, you had mentioned earlier that race is basically a construct, which we all know. And so is there a story in this, in Afrofuturism, about the construct of race and using it as the falsehood that it is?
I do. I think that it's a mythology. I think that in academia, that the technology of racializing the world has been well parsed out. You know, Cedric Robinson, Sylvia Wynter, and like the mythologies, their mythologies, how they use them to understand themselves as white are present. And maybe the manifestation that became interesting to me, or my own hypothesis, is that the technology of their story about whiteness, the kind of fulcrum of it to me, is just my hypothesis, is a fear of annihilation, which is kind of what's behind that quote you read, that the greed that we observe in white culture as like a normal thing or as an aspirational thing comes from this fear of annihilation, fear of genetic annihilation.
Yep.
And the sort of obsession with dominating nature also comes from this fear of annihilation at the fulcrum. Obviously, if you look at like the kind of culture war that's at present now in the public education system around essentially white ethno-nationalism needing to feel culturally central to what America is, quote unquote, is about a fear that essentially, you know, their kids they're gonna be rapping. They're not gonna be singing
they
whatever.
are.
You know, I mean, which they already lost that war. You know what I mean?
That's a lost war. That in manga, we lost it.
Yeah.
But then, like, how much is it wrapped up in patriarchy, and how much does it overlap? Because the whole domination thing, the need to dominate and overpower and claim everything and rule over others, it's like they go hand in hand, you know?
Yeah. Agree. I think the fear of annihilation is also existential male fear, you know, for sure. In that sense, is a fulcrum of, like, as you said, this sort of toxic masculine violent dominant reaction or overreaction. I think it just stands in stark contrast to how I experience blackness in my own body, which is something that I can't imagine not existing.
Mm-hmm.
I can't form a fear around it not being annihilated as a cultural form or as a phenotype or any concept of what black is. I can't imagine it like not being there. Because I just don't think it's just not going to happen. It's like, I think like somebody told me about, like, he's a botanist, and he was like, people say that all these plants go extinct in the Amazon because of deforestation, but that's actually technically false, because the way the soil works, if it ever existed, it can always kind of respawn, basically, because of just the nature of essentially the entirety of Earth would have to collapse for the plants to actually be extinct.
Right.
I think that there's a similar understanding to just Black culture, because they really, at least when I understand it, the way I understand it in me and in our people, is that indescribable connection to the elements, understanding ourselves as an expression of the elements, which is hard to even speak in English. Like, you can't even really use English to describe what that is, but it is an annihilatable.
What language can you describe it in?
You know, in Yoruba or many others, but, you know, it just to the point about how English is like, it's only useful for taxonomy. It's mostly useful for taxonomy and like creating categorization that will allow for a brutal kind of plundering and violence that can only come from being able to name that genre really good for theaters and that one not. You know what I mean? Like, don't put that movie out because that kind of movie doesn't work, or don't put that song out because that kind of song doesn't work, or that one does. So make that, you know, you can only do that. Yeah.
Right.
To your point.
So, Terence, can I ask you, like, in your work, and I watched Random Acts of Flyness a lot, and I saw that you really talked a lot about race and gender through, I don't even know, I don't want to call your work anything, but I think you said Afro-surrealism is more your approach in that particular work. Can you talk about your approach to, like, race and gender in that, and why this, I hate to say genre, but you can call it whatever you want. You can use your words to describe why you chose to do it, to create it in this way.
No, I mean, I think it's an expression of a collective of people, you know, myself and essentially a family of artists who have been working together in different formations for a while by the time that first season came out. So I think of it as evidence of us, you know, the 7 people who were writing it. Obviously, I become the person who has to spend a lot of time with it, but I think it as a soil space, like growing it is a project of those people, and who run the gamut. There's a lot of women, a lot of queer women, a lot of men, queer men, people who identify in between. And I think that figuring out of being gendered, being racialized, and then figuring out what we actually are creates that energy that you're kind of naming of like, there's this oppressiveness to even being named in this colonial system. So how do we tell a new mythology that helps us understand what we feel like, I think the language of cinema it has infinite potential to articulate that, but it hasn't really made use of that potential necessarily, especially maybe on larger platforms. So I think the disruption of gender, quote unquote, race, comes from just the stuff we were feeling and talking about, and then just our facility with the tools of cinema.
I think it's interesting that we've talked about ancestral technology, and I wanted to talk about particularly dreams and visions and interactions with ancestral spirits. And if you guys have had any of that and how it's found its way into your belief system and your work. And particularly, Terence, because I think that the way that random acts of flyness presented itself to me was almost like going through dimensions in many different spots and points and just existing free from the linear that we were talking about. And I'm just wondering if you've had any experiences that help you see this way and then how it affects your work.
All the time. I have all kinds of visions, dreams that come through in all kinds of portals between sleep and awake, walking down the street, having conversations. Even, when y'all talking, I'm like, other entities start speaking. I just start writing stuff down. I had a few experiences recently, one in which, I had a encounter with what Ifa we call the Ori, or like some concept of myself experiencing myself across time,
Really? You've had that?
Yeah.
You've seen yourselves across time?
Yeah, it was not even ocular. It was like I visited myself and have been visited by myself.
In dreams or in...
Nah.
Shit. So exciting.
In just moments at the beach.
Really? Okay, wait. Do you feel comfortable sharing this? Because I'm so interested.
Yeah. We can have
so you're sitting on the beach.
I can call you and give you the uncut version at some point.
No, seriously.
I'll give you the public version. But yeah, I think that my general spiritual practices are about that, are about finding ways to using ritual and the elements to facilitate that type of contact. And that's one entity. Like my spirit is one entity. And I think in that moment I visited, I was with myself at 10 in a very hard moment because I called myself clearly, because I needed somebody. So that moment happened and I was like, oh, if that moment hadn't happened, I wouldn't know that it's possible to call on myself.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's, every comic is that, like something really bad happens and it gives you a new facility, a new tool, but it couldn't, and then you're always in this sort of like the tragedy that the universe has to work like that, that to get these skills of interdimensionality, you have to have, somebody has to die or something, like something, seemingly traumatic has to happen. But I think the portal making that comes from being in contact with beings in different realms, ethereal realms, non-physical realms, that contact and that guidance is what is coming through in this stuff that I'm making. Random Acts specifically, like the whole parable of the Pirate and the King came through in a moment like that. It was a real, the whole thing was like, you got to tell the stories about the parable of the Pirate and the King. This is how it's operative in your life. This is what archetypes are. This is what, it was all just, it just came through. I don't know the entity.
Downloaded to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know the entity that really wanted to say that, but it wasn't Terence. You know what I mean?
What were you doing when you got that?
I was in a ceremony and I was dancing.
Okay.
So I was like dancing. I don't know. I was moving. I was like moving in exaltation to this being. There's some sort of star system. Like I don't know what star it was a specific star I was looking at. So I think that what came through working with that story, that fable, was the pursuit of how fables could operate as divinatory tools. Like you go, to any kind of diviner situation where there's a priest or in the Catholic Church or Babalawo, they're going to tell you some fable, and it's going to need to mean something to you, and that's the pursuit of random acts generally. But in the second season, the fable is the fable of deindustrializing yourself, the fable of going to perform the initiation with your people that would have happened if you were born within your culture, but you weren't. So you got to go find it. You know what I mean? And that's the fable, right? And I was in that fable in life. And it was also the fable that was coming through me. And I think it'll have utility, divinatory utility for the people who encounter it. And that all came because of the information that was channeled through in different rituals over a few years, So I think it's not abstract. The question you asked is real, pointed, in that, do you have these experiences and how do they make the thing? And I think it is that, these experiences are happening and they are what facilitate the making of things. And I think what else I was saying is with music, I think that's more just elemental of the process of we as people, as a musician myself, the ritual of being in a place where the thing can be channeled through is just part of what it is elementally. And you don't,
Exactly what it
there's a
is.
pressure to name it even, or
No,
I
it
make
comes
this sound
through.
means, so you're an antenna, but in film we have all this colonization and industrialization that it's you've got to make your story and it's got to be this genre coming, and so.
Well, that exists in music too. It's not in music, it's in the business of music.
That's right.
Yeah. And we talk about that a lot at Random Acts. We always talked about ourselves as making a concept album. We're making music, and it should be understood as that process of channeling.
Yeah.
So did you say, I don't know if I got this term right, divinatory utility?
Yeah.
See, that's what I think is the most fascinating thing of this whole conversation, right? Is that what we're talking about and why I thought Afrofuturism was cool as a framework is because it's really about imagining and dreaming up a reality, right? At the core of it, John?
Yeah, that's right.
And creating the whole from fragments, past, present, future.
Yep.
But sort of through dreaming, through imagination, through visions, creating something that hasn't existed, whether it's the future or not. It's just something that hasn't existed, right?
Right.
And I think art in general, for me, is about offering that divinatory utility, right? It's about finding ways to incorporate the insight. Everybody's not seeing themselves at 10 or whatever, but I think everybody does have the potential to tap into that divine source and get some inspiration, however it may be. And I think that for artists, obviously there's different levels of artists and creators on that path. And unfortunately, I think the ones at the most base level do often become the most successful because they're the most relatable. The higher up you go on the spiritual thing, it's you're weird and you're hard to understand and all that stuff. But I do think it trickles down. And I think that it is the ability to dream and to create and to translate this information into story, into music, into visuals is so, so important in the world where we are right now.
Yes.
And so that's what I'm interested in about the future, whatever that means, and how we get there and how we can envision it. And basically why dreaming and is important and imagination is important.
I feel like I'm always in a fugue state. I feel like my head is always halfway in a dream space all the time anyway, because I'm a storyteller and I'm always looking at what is the story of this thing? And it happens to me all the time where because of the fact I feel like whatever that thing is that we're connected to, that makes us creators or vessels for creation, I'm always connected to it. And I have the opposite thing. I never get writer's block. Never. I have the opposite problem where it's this wave or rush of stories and images simultaneously that are always happening. When I draw something, you ever seen a bear on a nature show, just grab a fish from a babbling brook? That's how images are to me. I see racing images all the time and I just pick one and that's how my head works. Same thing with stories and designs and things of that nature. It's almost like a constant output. And so a lot of times I'm trying to figure out ways to not be in that space. So to rest.
That's why you don't remember your dreams. Because you got
exactly. I'm always dreaming.
You're crowded. You got to create the space to get the other stuff.
Yeah, I'm trying to. I try. Another thing that I think the West has given us is this idea of the lone auteur. Like, I am a artist and I've created this thing. I am brilliant. But I like the way that Terrence is talking about it. It's like it's a community. And so I think about that too. It's like it's a communal hero. It's a communal experience where we're making things differently. And one of the things I told the students about is when I think about Afrofuturism, there isn't a Doctor Who character. There isn't a Sherlock Holmes. That it's all of us making things together that actually save everyone. It's not about the individual a lot of times. It's about like, well, these things are passed to us to a network of folk. And that's why I think about ancestors being kind of like apps. They're always uploading and always up. Even the Loa, if you think about like from voodoo practices, I mean, the Loa, the spirits that are worshipped in voodoo, are always updating themselves. They change according to the systems that they present themselves in. And also, I was thinking about this when Terrence was talking about like the idea of divination. They're called by symbol systems called Veve, right? So they're symbols. And so you basically write those and you bring them there. It's almost like I still call emoji, if you want to, like, not to, not to, you know what I'm saying? But that's what they are, you know? So,
Technology.
right. So yeah. And so if you look at like stuff like, this book by William Gibson called Count Zero, the Orisha are there in in cyberspace because they would be, right? And so I was thinking about, the idea of drawing, not just drawing, but also drawing, like pulling things through into other spaces. That's something I think about a lot. And another reason why I'm so attracted to comics is because, first of all, they're inherently surreal as a practice. They're strange because so much of it is about you projecting your ideas onto these really simple scratches. But then, like, you juxtapose two seemingly different instances and you create a story, but you're creating that story by taking two images that are juxtaposed, much like a quilt, actually, which is why I'm so fascinated by comics. But to your question about like, have I had experiences like that? I do remember I had to be like maybe 11 or so. And I remember looking in a mirror, right, for a second and seeing me like this, like how I am
Oh.
now. Yeah, and it was like it was really because. But here's the thing: it's a memory that you know how memory is like it's really unstable. It's like wisps of smoke, actually. But I do remember like I re-remembered it, like to borrow from like Toni Morrison. It's a re-remembering where I kind of like found it again, and that was really really empowering to me. I think if I did rest a little bit more, I'm always making something that I probably would remember the dreams more. But I feel like whenever I get inspiration from the inherent stories in things, if that makes sense, because everything has a story. Everything speaks to you.
No, everybody. I mean, everybody's stuff doesn't come through dreams anyway. Everybody gets stuff in different ways, and
Yeah, yeah. And I just get it from like phrases or like, glimpses of images or like, and the other thing too is I think designers, artists, in fact, make connections where people forget. I forgot the guy that said this, but he said to see a thing is to forget the name of the thing that one sees or something like that.
oh, that's cool.
Yeah, because what happens is like you actually remember like what that thing actually is. Like you see a chair, but you forget like its function and all this kind of stuff. It's almost like re-engaging with the chairness of a chair. Does that make sense? It's really weird, I know,
Yeah, it
but
does.
it's
I had a conversation yesterday about manifesting,
yeah,
and it was basically like you don't think of what it is that you think you want to happen. You
mhm,
think about the energy of where you'd be if it happened, or if you think, or where you want to be at.
yeah.
So it's like it's not the naming of the thing that you want. It's the vibration, the
It's
frequency that
understanding
you
what
want.
the thing is. Yes,
So
yeah,
it's
yeah,
the same thing. It's like the name gets in the way,
that's right. Yeah,
right?
exactly. Name gets in the way, and so we, but like Terrence said earlier, it's that labeling is I mean, honestly, it's a type of violence, that we've tried,
It
that we've
it
actually
really it really can be.
that we've learned how to deal with, and it's like I said, I mean, one of the reasons why I became an academic is because, I saw early on that the things that I was making were being used to sell things that people didn't need, as a designer, because my training is in graphic design. So I was like, I need to figure out a way to live in this system that we're in, but also try to unmake some of the systems that I feel like are really detrimental to us. Because being a designer, everybody is a designer, but we always think about graphic design being in like marketing and like advertising and stuff like that. So I got to a point where I was actually teaching students how to manipulate people, which I felt really bad about. So that's why I shifted from being a graphic design professor to teaching media studies so we can understand the language of media and the language of stories and unpack that.
Well, you went to somewhere interesting because I had another quote from Terrence about shifting consciousness.
Hmm.
And I'm going to read it again. But you said, whatever it is in terms of the human body that makes it very difficult to consume consciously or to be aware in the act of consumption, that's our fatal flaw. And I think that a complex part of producing media for conscious consumption means to just call out the tragedy of that flaw, to say, I'm lying to you, but it doesn't matter. and everyone's lying to you. And it's very easy to craft this opiate for this moment. See how easy it was, which I thought was a really interesting quote. And so what I took from that is it's okay to manipulate your audience as long as you take them somewhere they haven't been and expose them to some sort of new truth through your intentionally exposed lies, basically.
Right.
I mean, if my first thing was going to say that you need to start teaching that class again, because we need people like you with the prayer you're within, letting people know what the tool is, because, it's not moral. I don't think one can moralize it. The practice of having a facility with these tools, cinema, media, images, design, and the fact that it's going to have an effect on the person making it first and then the people who see it, it is actually more about the technology. What is the prayer? What's the intention that's going into it, and being just aware and mindful of that. Not necessarily afraid, I would say, which is, I think, a healthy fear. It's more just like a respect, but of what might happen when a kid is influenced. And for me, it was like, in the second season, a lot of the thinking was around the Hippocratic Oath and how lawyers and doctors take this, oath to do no harm theoretically, which is obviously a kind of lip service. But, filmmakers, musicians, designers do not take that oath because we just don't. There's this sort of strange, opaque veil over the fact that the tools we have do also have a transformative effect on the body and spirit that can hurt people if we don't.
I mean, look at like Facebook and the whole Mark Zuckerberg thing, It's just like...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it is a sort of thing where, like, if we did have a Hippocratic Oath to do no harm, you know what I mean, then maybe there would be no horror movies. Maybe they wouldn't even exist. You know what I mean? Or maybe there would be or just more conflict. Maybe it would be too precarious. So maybe that's not the idea. But I just think it's an important thing to, approach the tools with that level of awareness of, how those tools have been developed to sell people on a thing, to incept the human mind with whatever idea is central to it. And, most of what's on TV, the idea is to incept you to that the world is white. You should aspire to be wealthy in this way. You should aspire to, own this and that. You should aspire to have this type of romantic relationship that should go this way and have this type of child who should live forever. Like that's the Western mythology maybe. And then, you start to understand like, oh, okay, that no. I refuse that. You know what I mean? So I think that's the awakening in terms of how to be mindful of the tools. And, we brought in a hypnotist into the writer's room on the second season because I was really curious about just how that works. Like, how does incepting work at a neurological, spiritual level? Because, you've seen them street hypnotists, they just walk up on somebody and then they just like put them to sleep. It's like, how does this work?
I've never seen that. You've seen that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
On the street?
Yeah, people
with no permission?
Well, I think there must be something happening behind the scenes, you know what I mean? But there's a few street hypnotists on YouTube which can like really quickly put people under. Outside of that, it also came from a friend of mine who, with her childbirth experience, she learned a self-hypnosis technique. I was like, oh, that's interesting. That it came from that. And the hypnotist talked about the methodology of putting people in a theta state so they could be influenced. And it was like, it's a whole thing. It's something anyone can do. And you just realize the image, that's what we're doing. Like, I started to understand at that time, the first season, through the lens of its technique of incepting thoughts into the imagination. And we were using essentially what they call a hypnosis disruption technique, which is basically you just confuse people really fast. And then he's say what you want to say. And you're like, oh, Trump's using disruption technique. You know what I mean? That's what he's doing. Right. So it's like, these are technologies, to the point of the original.
Well, so then if that's the case, and if that's what all media and so many things in our culture are doing right now, it's cool that this type of speculative fiction is a way of doing the same thing. It's like incepting thoughts into imagination, but reframing what truth is, reframing how the impossible could be possible, reframing all these things that in a time where everyone's literally addicted to their phone.
Yes.
It's literally tapping out like all of our dopamine and basically taking out the ability to create and to be creative and to think and to move and to do all these things that we need to do to really create energy of creation and imagination. So basically, this type of work is a way to re-infuse those things into our psyches, our imaginations. And I think that's why it's so important in times like right now I don't even need to list
Yeah, yeah.
everything that's happening right now, but it's really, really heavy. And it's for the more sensitive beings, it can be really soul crushing and debilitating. And I think for me, you can feel like everything, whether it's Palestine or elections coming up or anything, there's a helplessness that, anything you do, you just hit a brick wall. These are the times when this type of work is really, really important. And these skill sets, like I do shamanic journeying. And I remember one time I did one because you can do with your spirit animal, the lower world, or the higher world is with your higher spirit guide, human form. I was doing one. And in this particular vision I saw, my body was like light. It just turned into light. I was light.
Hmm.
And I was following my God. He was light as well. And we were following along. And then we came to this wall. And then he was gone. It was just me. And I was at this wall. And I'm like, how am I supposed to get through the wall? And in life, I tend to, when I come up against a wall, I tend to back up and go harder, back up and go harder. Like, I can do it, and I just try to will my way through life.
Right.
Right. This is I'm trying to undo.
Mm.
And I tried that. And then finally I was like, I don't know how. I don't know how to get around the wall. And I sat down and I opened a book. This is in the vision.
Mm.
And then I went into the book.
Mm.
And then when I went into the book, I was past the wall. I never would have thought that, but that to me was such a learning experience because it's like, oh, sometimes sit your ass down when you don't know what to do. Just sit down and shift focus and wait and be open,
Right.
and you'll find a way through. And that to me is what dreaming with the imagination and what these types of things that we're talking about, speculation in a creative way, is so practical right now.
I often talk about the fact that when you start really opening your mind about speculation about like our ancestors and history, that, Dr. King becomes Afrofuturist, right? Because
Right.
he uses metaphor of the mountaintop, right? Borrowed from Saidiya Hartman, it's a critical fabulation where he's thinking about this mountain space. It's a future space where it's almost like a Star Trek moment where everybody's equal, everybody's holding hands. And I often tell my students, imagine trying to find that on a GPS locator, right? That doesn't exist yet. So he's using a radicalized imaginative space to actually imagine a better space for everyone, right? And I always say one of the first like Afrofuturists ever was the first slave that was like, you know what? The slavery ain't good for me. I think that this is not a good look for me. I'm going to actually escape and I'm going to head north, right? Or like the folk who during the Great Migration, even these are people who are speculating better spaces. Well, Chicago was like
Right.
Wakanda, that kind of idea. These were spaces that people were aspiring to a better life. And so some of this actually led me and my friend Rico Chapman to come up with this idea called Planet Deep South. We started thinking about the fact that a lot of these ideas are generated out of a slower space, like the South, where you actually had some time to look at the clouds
Yes.
and actually imagine better spaces out of the South. I mean, even Terence, right? Aren't you from Texas, right? As I recall. Yeah. See,
Mhm.
Mississippi, and so we're looking at like, and then of course Santi has roots in the South as well.
I'm
So
not
we actually have
included.
like you are. I mean, that's what you write. That's what your book's about, right? So
No, I know. My family's from Mississippi, but I'm definitely a city girl from Philly.
you're a
But
city girl, but also too, there's an aspiration. Well, like, why are you a city girl? That kind of thing. So we actually went back to my alma mater, Jackson State University. We created a space called Planet Deep South, where we brought all these scholars who had never been to Mississippi, some of them, to actually think about this is where some of this stuff starts, is aspiration of a better space. That's what it really does decentralize that original definition of Afrofuturism. And we incorporated all these different strands of the Black imagination. So I think that's really important. And you think about like Robin D.G. Kelly's book, Freedom Dreams, where he actually talks about in order for you to get to a space, you have to imagine yourself in that space. You have to think about,
exactly.
okay, well, what's next? That kind of thing. So that's a very sci-fi kind of ideology, right? It was like the what if, what if I actually leave here and I go out to California and get this industry job and build another space for myself? So those are some of the things I think about a lot of, and I teach from that space to community, various types of thinking about technology. The fact that these spaces seem to be a lot more gender equal as well. You know what I'm saying?
You know what? Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, yeah. That's a space where there are a lot of women, Black women working in these spaces too, like the Grand Dame.
from early on.
From the beginning, like, yeah, very much. So you look at Pauline Hopkinson's work. I mean, she was already coming up with work that I think could actually be like, it predates Wakanda, but that space that she made up with Of One Blood is very like Wakanda. Seriously. And this is like in the early 1900s. So
But even like for like people who define the category, like Octavia Butler, have women been just as much pioneers in this space? And have they dealt a lot with feminist stuff in this genre?
I would say, yeah. I mean, if you think about it, like most of the voices in the literary space in particular are women. And also, when you look at the people who have been keeping the space, the first like listserv was created by Alondra Nelson. People like, Nalo Hopkinson and Tananarive Due and all these different writers. And also scholars like Yatasha Womack and Tiffany Barber, people like that are actually cultivating and kind of like spreading that around actually too. So it's, yes.
And I know even in music, Janelle Monáe has been like really credited with talking a lot about Afrofuturism, but I've heard them say they want to tell their stories through the lens of young Black women, speaking to the future and stuff like that. But I haven't. Well, I don't know as much as you do about this. That's why I was wondering: were there worlds created where somebody literally focused on undoing patriarchy in a future world, where that's the focus, or is it just like women are like, well, we can do this too, and we create it, and we can make ourselves powerful, and we can make sexism not exist, and we can like, how has it been implemented?
So, Octavia Butler in particular, who, like you said, is a pioneer of secular fiction, right? She talked about power structures in general. So she did talk about racism and sexism and all these different powers. She wrote about power as a war. In fact, she said one of her biggest fears is that mankind always creates hierarchies. And then the second fear is that mankind always puts itself at the top of the hierarchy. And so
Right.
all of her
Right.
work is about dealing with those types of hierarchies and stuff like Parable of the Talents, Parable of the Sower, Kindred even.
Right.
So I would say, yeah, most of the work that I see coming from Black women who are working in the speculative space are about making those systems less natural because, and it's something that Terence touched on it too, is that we naturalize these systems through practices. It seems natural, but it's an unnatural technology because we've actually created stories and propaganda to actually make it seem natural, but it's unnatural. And so I think that our stories actually disrupt that all the time. And most of them are women. We have a lot of women writing in those spaces because of the fact that you can actually imagine a better space.
Right.
That's why I reference Saidiya Hartman's work of like critical fabulation. I think of myself as a critical maker, that kind of idea where it's art making, but it also is with a lot of intention, like you said as well. And I've been looking backwards a little bit too. I've been looking at some of the work of Bell Hooks, who's become an ancestor, but I was thinking about her work in Black aesthetics, the idea of creating something that's strange and oppositional. I mean, I focused on that a lot. Like, what is a Black aesthetic? She said it has to be, it's odd, but it's also in opposition to something that's trying to control you, that kind of thing. Or looking at the criteria of Negro art by W.B. Du Bois, where he's like, art is propaganda, and I don't want to look at anything that isn't. Seriously. So it's like the ancestors are still there talking about these things.
Right.
James Baldwin said, artists are here to disturb the peace. What is that peace? I think the peace is like this sleepiness.
Yeah, the peace is being numb and sort of
Exactly.
Walking Dead, zombies.
Yep.
Bela said. But aside from being addicted to everything, it's just they've created this grind culture where you just have to work yourself into exhaustion to barely make it. So it doesn't leave time, like you said, in the places where there's a slower pace of life, you're able to do that. Like I said, I'm from Philly, but I lived in New York for most of my adult life. And then I remember at a particular time where I made the shift from working in music industry and trying to do a bunch of other things to where I was like, I think I'm going to be an artist. Try to learn how to sing. I moved back to Philly because it was slower and I could not have to pay so much to live. And it was there that I figured out the whole next chapter of my life. And I think it's really hard when you don't have the space and the time to rest and to dream.
My friend Nadia Corafor, she posted this thing about boredom and about having space to actually imagine. Something I used to do because I came up in this really slow agrarian space. I used to literally climb on top of a barn and stargaze, like something out of a storybook. I would look at clouds and make shapes, Back in the day, like when we were kids, we would actually go and take a newspaper when those really were prevalent and make a pirate's hat and we'd make a sword. But now when you make a movie, especially Disney, you got the lunch boxes, you got t-shirts, you got the action figures, everything's prescribed. And so what it's done is it's actually disrupted children's culture where it was a privilege to be bored.
Well, the iPad is the ultimate disruptor.
So it's like,
well, that's part of the industrialization that Terence is talking about. Right, Terence?
Yeah, gotta be industrialize ourselves.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. This is like a long time coming. I'm really happy that we got it done.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in this conversation. So I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
No, it was a pleasure. It's a great honor. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, John and Terence. We'll be back in a couple weeks with another episode of Noble Champions.